All right, so number four, being specific. This one seems pretty obvious, but it's actually the one I have a hard time getting a lot of students to spend time doing. Too often writing is vague or just not specific enough. I think sometimes people fear if they're too specific, it won't resonate with enough people. But actually, the opposite is true. The more specific our writing is, the more universal it is as well. And beyond that, think of how much more effective a line like the last one on section 4 is. Sarah strolled in, clutching a fistful of violets, when we compare it to simply saying she's walking in with a handful of flowers. The changes are simple, but hugely impactful. We can see the way she's walking now when we use that great strong verb of strolled. And she's not holding flowers, she's clutching violets. This is visual, this is imagery versus information. And we need to always strive for that. Imagery instead of information, or information via imagery, if you want to think about it that way. And I would write that down. This class is called The Art of Observation, and I think this example we're on is a good example of how you can benefit from being still and observing. If you truly observe, you'll zoom in on those specific details. You'll want to share that it's a warm peach instead of simply being fruit. You'll want to get across the sensory detail of the smooth skin of a beech tree instead of just writing that it's the trunk of a tree. You'll want to make those violets pop in the mind's eye of your reader instead of just giving information that a character possesses some flowers. This is how a writer must think and write, very carefully, very precisely. In section 5, I've given you some examples of great beginnings. But what makes them great? Lots of things, but mainly the following, which you may want to jot down. Number 1, they drop us into the action. Number 2, they supply a mystery and a love story. And what I mean by that is that they supply the two main elements of storytelling, emotion and suspense. I don't think anything is more important. Write that down. Emotion, suspense. Number 3, they establish tone or voice. All of these examples exhibit that beautifully, I think. Look at how different the voice is in each one. All three are in first person point of view, but each voice is very singular. The Kay Gibbons example is straightforward, economic. The Irving example is somewhat flowery and formal. The Walker example is lyrical, even prayerful. Each word has been very carefully chosen while also balancing it to sound like a 14-year-old uneducated girl has written it. Number 4, each is confessional. It's always a good trick to draw a reader in by confiding in them. This can work even if you're not using the first person voice, but I find that a confessional tone works the best in that first person. Number 6 is characterization, and I'll be covering that in a whole lecture in the future. And number 7 as well, since the place will be covered in a lecture I'll be doing later. Section 8, adverbs, adjectives, nouns, and verbs. Again, this is self-explanatory, so be sure to look at this section carefully. It's a really important one. I think we tend to think good writing means using lots of flowery language because most of us were taught that in high school. We were taught to load our sentences down with as many adjectives and adverbs as possible to make the sentences full of beautiful words. But the more I know about writing, the more I know that the key is actually to create beautiful imagery by using the perfectly chosen words, not necessarily the most beautiful ones or the most perfect ones. I do not mean that you should cut all adverbs and adjectives out of your writing. I love adjectives and adverbs. What I do mean is that you have to be conscious of them and you should use them sparingly, especially adverbs. During revision, I go through my manuscript and I put a circle around all the adverbs and a little box around all the adjectives. And I ask myself if they really need to be there or not. Sometimes they do, but more often than not, they don't because they're keeping me from using a really strong noun or a really strong verb. So that's a really good test to put to your writing in revision. All good writing is made up of strong nouns and verbs. In section 9, we're looking at expanding the abstract emotions. This is one we will try to talk about later, but I've given you an example here of writing about the abstract. It's one of the most important elements of literary writing, but it's the one we tend to talk about least. We don't talk much about it because it's really hard to talk about. But the main thing to know is that often in our writing, we're doing this. It's sort of our jobs as writers to be articulating what others find incredibly hard to articulate. An abstract notion is something like love, death, sin, guilt, belief. All those things show up again and again in our writing, of course. If you look at this Zora Neale Hurston example, you'll see how important being good at the art of observation is. She is totally imagining this image of death, and it's so effective because of the careful way she has thought about it as a writer. And we can only think about things in so profound a way if we do deep looking at the world around us. I'm going to read this one to you. So Janie began to think of death, that strange being with the huge square toes who lived way in the west, the great one who lived in the straight house like a platform without sides to it and without a roof. What need has death for a cover, and what winds can blow against him? He stands in his high house that overlooks the world, stands watchful and motionless all day with his sword drawn back, waiting for the messenger to bid him come. Been standing there before there was a where or a when or a then. She was liable to find a feather from his wings lying in her yard any day now. She was sad and afraid too. I really love this little passage because she's truly conjuring the feelings of grief and dread that we so associate with death, especially in thinking about our own mortality. This is a really masterful piece of writing from a masterful writer, and this is the kind of writing we should all hope to achieve. In number 10, this section, we're looking at dialogue. This is a pretty detailed section of the handout packet, but the main three things I'll reiterate from this handout are: make every single line of dialogue full of tension. Dialogue must have a rhythm. And when using dialect, always use the SALT rule. And what I mean by that is, like salt, a little bit of dialect goes a long way. A little flavors and too much ruins. I use the same rule, the SALT rule, for cursing as well. I want to add a fourth really important rule for dialogue, and that is format it correctly, especially when it comes to dialogue tags. Now, I'm sorry, you can hear my dog moaning back there in the background in his sleep. Now, what I mean by dialogue tags are the he saids and she saids. Remember that for the most part, just saying he said or she said will suffice. The dialogue tags are where people tend to want to get flashy and use adverbs. Avoid doing that at all costs. You can look at this section of the handout more closely to think more about that. And if you want to ask me about it, we'll be doing a in-person like Google Room thing later in this class. But you can also always ask me about these things in the comments, and I'm glad to address any questions. So anything that you want me to expand on throughout this lecture or any future lectures, just in the comments section for where I post this, just tell me what you'd like to know, what you want to know more about.